He called her nobody, and paid every debt her father owed in silence. The Duke of Straffenmoor had two faces, and I was one of perhaps 3 men alive who had ever seen both of them. The first face the world knew, cold, exacting, a jaw cut from limestone and eyes the pale gray of winter sky just before snow. He had inherited the dukedom at 19 when his father died of a fever, and he had spent the 15 years since becoming exactly what a man in his position was required to become: unapproachable, efficient, and when the occasion demanded, cruel in the particular aristocratic way that is not cruelty at all but merely the withholding of warmth. The ton adored him for it, or rather they feared him, which in those circles amounts to the same devotion. The second face I had glimpsed only in the small hours, in the estate office by candlelight, when he believed himself entirely alone, and when a certain name appeared in the ledgers I was instructed, at all times, to keep locked. My name is Hadley. I have served as steward to the Duchy of Straffenmoor for 11 years. What I am about to set down I have never spoken aloud because the Duke forbade it. But he is married now, and she knows the whole of it, and she gave me her permission, gave it laughing, actually, with her hand tucked in his arm and her eyes bright, so I will write it as plainly as I can. The girl's name was Miss Cecily Vane. I first heard her name 3 years before the events I mean to describe, when her father's solicitor sent a letter to Straffenmoor House marked confidential, and for the Duke's eyes only, which were instructions that meant, in practice, first to Hadley's eyes, then summarized to the Duke over morning coffee. I read it and I felt cold. Mr. Arthur Vane had accumulated debts of a staggering variety: gambling notes, merchant accounts, a failed investment in a wool venture that had collapsed spectacularly, and the sum owed to various creditors now exceeded his annual income by a factor the letter was careful to state in round numbers, as if gentleness of arithmetic might soften the blow. He had one asset of note: his eldest daughter, Miss Cecily Vane, aged 19, who had recently been brought out in society and who was described by her father's solicitor, in language that still makes me cold when I think of it, as potentially of interest to a gentleman of means. The letter was not addressed to the Duke because of any connection between the families. It was a circular sent to a dozen titled households with the details altered for each: a fishing expedition, a father drowning in debt, casting a wide net. I summarized it to the Duke over coffee. I watched his face as I spoke, which told me nothing, as it generally told me nothing. "Burn it," he said. I burned it. But that evening late, after the house had gone quiet, I found him in the estate office. He had pulled the ledger of charitable disbursements. We maintained one quietly, for certain cases he did not wish discussed, and he was writing in it in his own hand, which he almost never did. He heard me in the doorway and did not look up. "The Vane creditors," he said. "I want the list, all of them, by morning." I stared at him. "Your Grace." "By morning, Hadley." I had the list by morning, and within the fortnight, by channels I was instructed to keep entirely untraceable, every debt belonging to Mr. Arthur Vane had been quietly, fully, and anonymously retired. The Duke did not speak of it afterward. He gave me one instruction: she is not to know. The father may be told only that an anonymous party settled the notes. No name. No connection to this house. I said yes, of course, Your Grace, and I said nothing further. But I was a steward, which meant I noticed things. And what I noticed in the months that followed was that the Duke began attending rather more social functions than had previously been his habit. I should describe Miss Cecily Vane as she was then, before the story takes the shape it does. She was not a beauty by the precise measurements the ton applied to such things. She was slight, with dark hair she wore simply, and a composure about her face that some read as coldness and others, the perceptive ones, understood immediately as something else entirely. She had been raised in a house of diminishing means, which gives a certain young woman one of two things: either a desperate anxiety, a constant reaching toward safety, or a very quiet, very settled understanding of what she actually values. Cecily Vane had the second thing. I could see it within 3 minutes of watching her at the Ashcroft Assembly, which was where I first observed her in person, having accompanied the Duke on what he described as a tedious obligation I have no choice but to fulfill. He had said this, I noted, about an assembly he had previously declined for 4 consecutive years. She stood near the windows. She was speaking with an older woman, a widow of modest circumstances, and she was laughing at something the woman had said, genuinely laughing, not the performed laughter of the room, but the real kind that reaches the eyes. She was not watching the door for eligible gentlemen. She was not arranging herself. She was simply present in the particular way of people who have learned to be content with what they have. The Duke stood 15 feet from her for the better part of an hour. He spoke to 3 MPs, a baronet, and a general. He did not approach her. But I tracked his gaze across the course of that hour, and it returned with the regularity of a pendulum to the slight dark-haired woman by the windows. On the carriage ride home, he said nothing. He looked out at the dark road and said nothing at all the whole way back to Straffenmoor House. I did not remark upon it. That was not my function. The second time I observed them in the same room was at Lady Pemberton's winter dinner, 6 weeks later. It was the kind of grand evening that existed purely to display wealth: 14 courses, a chamber quartet, 47 guests arranged by precedence at a table long enough to moor a small ship. The Duke was placed, by rank, at Lady Pemberton's right hand. Miss Vane, daughter of a gentleman of no particular consequence, was placed near the table's far end, between a retired solicitor and a clergyman's wife. I was not at the table, of course. I was in the house because the Duke had required me to handle a document for him before dinner, and I had not yet departed. I witnessed the evening's incident from the corridor, through the doorway. The Countess of Halsfern, a woman whose tongue was the sharpest implement in any room she entered, made a remark. I did not hear all of it, but I heard enough. Something about girls from declining houses and the particular desperation of a certain type of ambitious mamma, and a light, cutting laugh from the women nearest her that rippled down the table like a stone dropped in still water. Miss Vane had heard it, the table had heard it. The red that crossed her face lasted approximately 2 seconds before she mastered it, set her cutlery very precisely at the edge of her plate, and looked at nothing in particular with complete composure. The Duke had heard it also. I watched his profile from the doorway. He did not speak immediately. He finished the sentence he was delivering to Lady Pemberton. Then he set down his own glass with a deliberateness that caused the nearest footman to stand very still. "Lady Halsfern," he said. The table went quiet in the particular way. Tables go quiet when a very powerful man uses a very soft voice. "Miss Vane," the Duke said, "is a guest at this table. I would be grateful if she were treated as one." Nothing further. He returned to his conversation with Lady Pemberton, as though he had said nothing more remarkable than a comment about the weather. But the Countess of Halsfern did not speak again for the remainder of the dinner, and Miss Cecily Vane, I watched her from the doorway, I could not help it, looked up from her plate with an expression I could not fully read. Gratitude, yes, but also something careful, the look of a person who does not quite trust a gift whose origin she does not understand. She looked toward the head of the table. The Duke did not look back. I raised the matter with him the following morning. I did not intend to, but I had served the man for 11 years, and in 11 years I had developed, against my better professional judgment, something approaching concern for him. "The Vane family debts," I said. "She does not know." He looked up from a letter. "Correct. She believes them settled by an anonymous party." "That is what they were told." "And yet you attend assemblies. You defend her at dinner tables." He looked at me for a moment with the pale gray eyes. "Is there a question somewhere in this, Hadley?" I thought about it. "No, Your Grace." He returned to his letter. "Good." I left, but the ledger of charitable disbursements, I noticed over the following months, had acquired several additional entries. Small things: an anonymous gift to the lending library in the village nearest the Vane country cottage, a contribution untraceable to a music society Cecily Vane had been known to attend, a quiet word relayed through a third party to a landlord who had been applying pressure to the family's town lease. He never attended a function without knowing, in advance, whether she would be present. He never spoke to her directly, not once. A man can maintain this particular form of devotion, silent, careful, entirely contained, for a surprisingly long time if he is sufficiently disciplined. The Duke of Straffenmoor was the most disciplined man I have ever known. It lasted 2 years and 4 months before it broke. It broke because of a document. Specifically, because of a document I made an error with, the only significant error of my professional career, and one I have spent considerable energy since then deciding whether to regret. The Vane family's solicitor sent a second letter to Straffenmore House. This one was addressed, in error, a clerical mistake on their end, not to the Duke but to the Lady of Straffenmore House, a title that did not exist because there was no such lady, and which therefore landed not on my desk, but on the desk of the Duke's elderly aunt, Mrs. Farnley, who was visiting for the month, and who opened all correspondence addressed to female persons in the household as a matter of deeply ingrained habit. The letter thanked the anonymous benefactor, in language that was, this time, somewhat less oblique than it ought to have been, for the continued and generous interest shown in the welfare of the Vane family. Mrs. Farnley read it, then she read it again, then she came to find me. She handed me the letter without a word. She was 81 years old, and she had the eyes of a woman who had watched 4 generations of Straffenmore men make fools of themselves over unsuitable women, and who had reached the settled view that unsuitable was a relative term. "How long?" she asked. I said, 3 years approximately, ma'am. She nodded once, and the girl does not know. She took the letter back from me, folded it with great precision, and placed it in the pocket of her dress. "She will need to know," she said. "You understand that, Hadley?" I did not answer immediately. "A man," Mrs. Farnley said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who has chosen, for professional reasons, not to see it, who spends 3 years paying a woman's family debts and defending her honor at dinner tables and attending every assembly at which she appears without once speaking to her, is not conducting a charitable exercise. He is conducting a prolonged crisis, and prolonged crises, in my experience, require intervention. She left. I looked at the empty doorway for quite some time. Mrs. Farnley did not engineer it immediately. She was, as I have said, 81 and extremely patient. She chose her moment. The moment she chose was the Dunmore Winter Reception, which was held at Dunmore Park in December, and which was the largest social function of the winter calendar in that part of the country. Every family of consequence attended. The Duke attended because Mrs. Farnley informed him she wished to go and could not travel without his escort, which was not true, but which he could not in good conscience refuse. Miss Vane attended because her family had been invited. The Vanes' social standing had recovered considerably in the 3 years since their debts had been retired, a recovery the ton attributed to prudent management, and which I could have explained differently. Mrs. Farnley placed herself, with the precision of a chess player, in a location where she could observe both of them. And then she arranged, through a series of maneuvers I can only admire in retrospect, for Miss Vane to be brought to the small anteroom off the main salon, ostensibly to help her locate a dropped earring. At the same moment the Duke was passing through it toward the card room. I was in the corridor. I heard everything. I heard Mrs. Farnley say, with the serenity of a woman who has already decided the outcome, "Ah, Cecily, dear, you remember my nephew, the Duke of Straffenmore. Edmund, you know Miss Vane, of course." A pause. I knew that pause. It was the Duke not knowing what to do with his face. "Miss Vane," he said, one sentence, the flattest possible acknowledgement. "Your Grace," she said, equally flat. She had, I realized, very deliberately matched his register every time they had been in the same room. She gave him precisely as much warmth as he gave her, which was none, because she did not understand why he should want any. "I'll just," Mrs. Farnley said, and there was the sound of her unhurried footsteps departing, and then the door, and then nothing. Silence. I held my breath in the corridor. "Your aunt," Miss Vane said, "has left." "Yes," a pause. "She does that." Another silence. Longer. I could picture them, him standing with that studied composure, her with that particular composure that was a different thing entirely. "I should return to," she began. "Miss Vane." She stopped. He said nothing for a moment. I could hear, faintly, the music from the main salon. Something slow, something that gave a man time to organize his thoughts or to abandon them entirely. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For Lady Pemberton's dinner, for what Lady Halsfern said, I should have acted sooner." A pause. "You acted," she said carefully. "When many would not have, I was grateful." "You should not have needed protecting. That she spoke at all was," he stopped. "I am unused," he said, to finding the appropriate word. "I noticed," she said, and then very quietly, "It was kind, whatever your reason." I heard him go still. I knew the particular quality of his stillness. "My reason," he said. And I knew from his voice, which I had been reading for 11 years, that we had arrived, without either of them intending it, at the edge of the thing he had spent 3 years not saying. Your Grace, her voice was gentle but exact. She had, I thought, some instinct that they were closer to something than they had ever been, and she was choosing her footing with care. You have spoken to me perhaps 4 times in the years I have been in society. You are courteous when you speak, and then you are not present, and then at some function you are again. It is not, I do not mean to be unkind, but it is not a pattern that suggests particular interest. He said no. No, she agreed, so I am at a loss as to what you. The debts, he said. The word landed, I heard it land. Complete silence. I beg your pardon, her voice was very quiet. Another silence. He had not meant to say it. I was almost certain he had not meant to say it. But 3 years is a long time, and the word had been sitting at the back of his throat for most of it, and Mrs. Farnley had left, and the music was slow, and here they were. Your father's debts, he said, steady, committed now the way he committed to everything once the decision was made. 3 years ago, the creditors, they were settled by an anonymous party. Yes, she said slowly, we were told. It was not anonymous. Silence. It was you, she said. It was not a question. Her voice had changed in a way I could hear even through the door. Something that had been held very still inside her was moving. Yes. You paid, she stopped. Why? The longest silence yet. Because, he said, and I heard in his voice the particular texture of a man who has composed this sentence several hundred times in his own mind and finds, in the event, that none of the versions he prepared are adequate. You were standing by the windows at the Ashcroft Assembly, laughing at something Mrs. Haverall said, and you were not looking at the door, and you were not arranging yourself, and I could not think of anything else for the rest of the evening. Nothing from her, nothing at all. I was aware, he said, that this was not a feeling I was entitled to act on. I was aware that you had every reason to refuse any approach I made, and no particular reason to welcome it. I was aware that your family was in difficulty, and that acting on it would be, I did not want to be in a position where any reception you gave me could be attributed to obligation. I wanted, he stopped. He tried again. I wanted it to be clean. Clean, she said softly. I wanted if I ever. He stopped a third time. I had never in 11 years heard him stop this many times in the space of a minute. I did not want your gratitude. I wanted nothing from you. I wanted only that you were, that you were all right. The music from the salon played on, something with a cello in it now, low and patient. 3 years, she said. Yes. You have been, her voice broke and recovered. You have attended every assembly. Not every one. The ones I attended, she said. A pause, yes. And you have not, she stopped. You have not said a word to me in 3 years, not a single. No. Why? He was quiet for a moment, because I did not know what I had a right to say. I heard her breath just once then. Edmund Straffenmore, she said, and I noted, every part of me noted that she used his name, his Christian name, which no one used, which almost no one living even knew. You are the most exasperating man in England. He said nothing. You paid my father's debts, she said. You sat across ballrooms from me for 3 years. You defended me at a dinner table in front of 40 people without anyone asking you to. And you did not say a single word to me. No. And you intend to explain this as... I did not know, he said, how to ask for something I did not feel I deserved. The music from the salon, the cello, the slow, patient pull of it. Your Grace. Edmund. A long pause, then Edmund. Something settled in the silence after that. I could feel it, even through the door. The quality of the air between them changing, the way air changes when a storm that has been building for a very long time finally breaks and becomes simply rain. I did not know, she said quietly, that you had done any of this. I know. I thought you, she paused. At Lady Pemberton's, I thought perhaps you had acted out of the general way powerful men act when they wish a lower table to behave. I did not think it was, another pause. I did not know what to make of you. Most people don't, he said. I think, she said very carefully, that most people are looking at the first face. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what is the second face? "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I should like to find out." Mrs. Farnley was waiting in the corridor when the door to the anteroom opened. I confess, still there as well, having failed entirely to locate any reason to be elsewhere. Miss Vane came through the door first. Her face was composed. She was always composed. But her eyes were bright with something that had not been there before, something that had clearly arrived in the last 20 minutes and had no intention of leaving. The Duke followed. He looked at Mrs. Farnley. Mrs. Farnley looked back with the expression of a woman who had won a very long game of patience and was too well-bred to say so. "Aunt," the Duke said. "Nephew," she said pleasantly. "You dropped your earring deliberately." "I never drop things," she said. "I place them." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened to his face, something I had seen perhaps twice in 11 years, something that was, unmistakably, the beginning of a smile. "Go inside," he said. "I will find you shortly." She went inside. He turned to Miss Vane. He offered her his arm very correctly, very precisely, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she put her hand through it. "I believe," he said, "that we have missed several dances." "We have," she agreed. "I should like, if you are willing, to not miss the remaining ones." She looked up at him. "I think," she said, "that I can manage that." They went in. I stood alone in the corridor for a moment in the particular silence that follows something that has finally, after a long time, gone right. Then I straightened my jacket, put my professional face back in order, and went to inform the coachman that we would be staying somewhat later than planned. They were married in the spring, at a small church on the Straffenmoor estate, with Mrs. Farnley in the front pew looking entirely unsurprised. I was given the honor of witnessing the register. When I signed my name beside theirs, the Duke, in a moment entirely unlike him, entirely unlike anything I had seen in 11 years, looked at me and said very quietly, "Thank you, Hadley." I said, "For what, Your Grace?" He said, "For the list of creditors, for burning the letter, for 11 years of looking the other way." I said, "It was entirely my duty." He said, "No, it wasn't." The Duchess, Cecily, as she had asked me to call her, which I cannot quite bring myself to do but which I practice in private, reached across and touched my arm just briefly. She said nothing, but her eyes were the same as they had been in that anteroom corridor at the Dunmore reception, bright with something that had arrived and intended to stay. Outside, the estate was in early blossom. The old stones of Straffenmoor House caught the spring light and held it. 3 years of ledger entries, of quiet letters, of a man standing at the edge of ballrooms watching a woman laugh, all of it resolved, quietly and completely, into this. A register signed, a door open, a morning beginning. I closed the book and returned it to the clerk. The Duke of Straffenmoor offered his arm to his Duchess. She took it the same way she had taken it in that corridor, without hesitation, without performance. Simply and entirely. They walked out into the light.